Next on News Talk, AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show with Kevin Doran.
It's Brian O'Neill in for Kevin Doran again today here on a Wednesday, January the 14th, and we're on with Alfred University Professor of History, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
Well, I'm looking at the headlines on both Drudge and Huffington Post, left and right. From the Drudge Report, Jewish-owned D.C. business targeted by self-described ISIS militants. From Huffington Post, European Jews have not felt this threatened since World War II. Going over to the Washington Post, far right in Europe sees opportunity after a wave of terror in France. Foreignpolicy.com, Europe's new problem with anti-Semitism. Gary Ostrower, the former Hornellsville Town Board member Angela Caldwell was a big supporter of Israel, and she used to say to me in private conversations that the 1930s were repeating themselves all over again. Your thoughts?
There's an element of truth in this, and unfortunately, it's an important element of truth. I'm often, as a historian, as conscious of the differences as I am of the similarities. We like to say that, history repeats itself. Well, it never repeats itself exactly. But there are patterns, there are certain kinds of lessons I think that we can draw, and there certainly are some parallels. There is more anti-Semitism in Europe today than there has been since the 1930s and the early 1940s. That I think we can say categorically. And if I can pinpoint France, which has been, of course, in the news over the last few days, over the last year, just in 1 year, in the calendar year 2014, 7,000 French Jews have left France for Israel. And they're not leaving because they're, happy, so to speak, to be clearing out. They're leaving because they feel threatened. And what I find is kind of ironic. And by the way, that number 7,000 is greater than it was the previous year, when about 4,000 left. Where is the anti-Semitism coming from? It's coming from two areas, from, if you will, kind of the far left and the far right. On the far left, you have the Muslim population, at least much of the Muslim population, certainly not all of it, is rather anti-Semitic. Some of that is a product of the Arab-Israeli issue. But some of it goes deeper than that. Some of it has historic roots that go well before 1948, when Israel was created. By the same token, you have the far right. You have the beginnings of sort of, intimations of fascism. And you have this a little bit in Germany. More importantly, you have it in countries like Russia. You see it in Hungary, maybe most importantly in Hungary, where anti-Semitism, which has been around for a long, long time, someone called it the world's longest hatred. Well, it's back. So I don't want to exaggerate the degree of anti-Semitism, but I certainly don't want to minimize it either. And it's easy to minimize it from the perspective of Hornell, New York, from upstate New York, from the United States generally. But it's not so easy to minimize it when you're in the middle, when your own children are threatened, as, for instance, when Islamic radicals murdered 4 Jewish school children in a school in France just last year. There have been many anti-Semitic incidents. So, we're not talking about just a little bit of anti-Semitism there and so forth. We're talking about a pattern that's becoming more pronounced rather than less. And I don't know that it's going to diminish in spite of the unity that one experienced, I think, in Paris over the course of the last week or so. And I'd mention one other thing in respect to this. There were Muslims in Paris. Muslims in Paris during the Great Rally this past weekend, who had signs which in English said, "I am a Jew." In other words, expressing solidarity with the victims of radicalism, with the victims of terrorism. And I think it's important to recognize that, or to put it differently, what I'm saying is that the Islamic community is split. I think that there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the Islamic community. There's a lot of sympathy for radicalism, for terrorism, but there's also a great deal of opposition to it. And I think at the very least it makes us a little bit careful. We should be a little bit careful about the kind of generalizations that we make.
You talk about 1933 Europe and 2015 Europe. One big difference. As a reporter, the first thing that comes to my mind when you're talking about all the things that went wrong back then versus the chance of that happening again, web video. There are more news organizations doing web video. There are more news organizations. There are people on the streets taking out their cell phones and recording incidents. They were able to cover up what was going on in Germany in the 1930s for a while, and even it was until the end of the war. In today's technological world, with the media as it is today, and that includes the people on the street taking out their cell phone and recording things and sending it out right away. What do you think about that, Gary?
Well, I think that the point you're making is well made. You know, we know more. In some ways, perhaps we almost know too much. We have kind of a glut of information. It's difficult to fully make sense of, to assimilate all of the information that we're getting. But I still think that the basic point you're making is very, very important. But I would argue that there's one other really important difference between the 1930s and our own decade, and that is that at least in Europe, with the exception perhaps of Hungary, anti-Semitism does not have official government support, whereas during the 1930s, certainly in Germany, but to a lesser extent in other countries like Poland, and certainly after 1938 and 1939 in Italy, you had governments passing laws which essentially disenfranchised Jews, which stripped Jews of their citizenship, made them non-citizens, like what we call the Nuremberg laws in Germany, which were passed in 1935, which essentially, said a Jew cannot be and will not be a citizen of Germany. So, the power of the state right now is opposed to this kind of anti-Semitism, whereas in 1930 certainly that was not the case.
Would America and American allies like England go to war in Europe again if things do get out of hand in any way? And you say that the governments of Europe won't be the problem. If the terrorist groups in Europe become a problem, do you see America going over there under any conditions under Obama?
Under Obama? Probably not. But that's really short term in the sense that President Obama has less than 2 years left in office. If you ask me in the next 10 years, the answer is there a chance that would happen? I'd say for sure there's a chance that it would happen. Is it likely to happen? I'm an agnostic on that. I don't know. I really don't know. And I think that, historians, or maybe all of us who predict the future, are frequently, I'm certainly aware that many, many predictions turn out to be wrong. So, I don't want to make any, hard and fast predictions. But are there conditions under which we would go into the Middle East? You bet there are. And, that we would go to war. And a good example of this, I think, can in some ways extend back to the Carter administration, which did something which remains very, very, how shall I put it, influential in respect to even current American policy. And that is that President Carter enunciated a doctrine. And the doctrine was called the Carter Doctrine. The doctrine essentially said that the United States reserves to itself the right to take action if our supplies of fuel, that is to say, Middle Eastern oil, are threatened. Now, right now, today, 2015, we have plenty of oil. As a matter of fact, we are going to be, in a very, very short time, probably the largest oil producer in the world. And not only do we have a lot of oil, but we have a lot of natural gas. So, the issue in respect to fuel and the effect of fuel on powering not only the American economy but the European economy does not appear to be an immediate problem. But will it be a problem 5 years from now, 10, 15, 20 years from now? Maybe. I don't know. But if it is, I would expect that the Americans are going to defend their interests. But the other point I want to make, if I may, is that if you look at American policy from 1979, from the time of the Iranian Revolution until today, the United States has been involved in military action in 14 Islamic states in the Middle East. Now, when I say the Middle East, that includes Somalia in Africa. It includes Kuwait, of course. It includes Iran. It includes Iraq. It includes Syria right now. That's a lot. We're in something of a permanent war, okay, or at least a long-term war, and that worries me plenty. I mean, someone said that, what's going on in the Middle East today is kind of similar to what was happening in Europe back in the early 17th century. Well, what was happening in Europe in the early 17th century we call the 30 Years' War. And many of the conditions that stimulated, that encouraged, that created that war for 30 long years, many of those conditions exist today in the Middle East, not the least of which are civil wars, religious wars, the breakdown of civil society, the degree to which a lot of people are loyal to their religion and not to principles that we, as Americans, that we Westerners generally hold dear, like democracy, the rule of law, limited government, and so forth.
What about the safety of those in Israel after the attack in France?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you're asking. In other words,
the attack in France was totally unexpected. It was a complete shock to the entire world. Do you see copycats coming for Israel?
They've been coming for Israel for a long time. The reason why it has not happened recently in Israel is because the Israelis, number one, have probably, in terms of their own security, a very, very effective intelligence organization. Secondly, they have a wall, a wall which many of the Israeli opponents and critics call an apartheid wall. Well, it's not an apartheid wall. It's a security wall. And until that security wall was built about 10 years ago, there were frequent bombings of suicide bombings of pizza parlors and of bar mitzvahs and so forth. In other words, you had a large number of Israeli casualties. No longer today. But, might it happen again? The answer is you bet. Sure. Sometimes the offense is better than the defense.
Were you surprised at the Delhi attack in France?
No, I wasn't. I read an email post which says something to the effect of, isn't it ironic that these terrorists duck into and take cover in a kosher delicatessen? Well, it wasn't by accident. They went in there to kill Jews. They went in there to take Jews hostage. And I think, again, it's a part of a larger, very, very disturbing pattern of Islamic opposition, this Islamic hatred of Jews. And, this is not an isolated incident. It happens to be the most well-publicized of the incidents, the most dramatic of these incidents, but there are hundreds and hundreds of attacks on Jewish schools, on Jewish businesses. There's a museum in Belgium, a Jewish museum in Belgium, that was attacked a couple of years ago. We're going to see much more of this in the next 10 years.
We're talking with Alfred University Professor of History, Dr. Gary Ostrower. And when we get back, we're going to talk about a very interesting course that Dr. Ostrower teaches at Alfred University and the power of web video, in particular YouTube, and some of the videos that have been popping up lately. Back on the Newsmaker Show, Brian O'Neill filling in for Kevin Doran on the line with Dr. Gary Ostrower, who was good enough to come on this morning and talk about the situation in France. Dr. Ostrower, tell us about the course that you teach at Alfred University about Middle Eastern religions and their relationships with one another.
I'm teaching a course called Arabs, Israelis, and American Foreign Policy. It's a course that deals with the period from, roughly speaking, the beginning of the 20th century, and will conclude with, I'm sure, what happened in Paris. Although, Paris is not directly germane to Israeli politics, but it certainly is indirectly related to it. It's a course, in other words, that deals with, among other things, the position of the British during the First World War, when they enunciated what we call the Balfour Declaration, which stated that Jews have a right to their own homeland. It deals with the increasing violence during the 1930s as a result of German policy. Increasing number of Jews were escaping from Europe into Israel, or at that time it was Palestine, and therefore, in some ways, exacerbating some of the tensions between the Palestinian Arabs on one hand and the Palestinian Jews on the other hand. It deals with the situation in 1947 and 1948 when the United Nations overwhelmingly endorsed the establishment of an independent state of Israel, of a partition that would allow for part of Palestine to be Arab and part of Palestine to be Jewish. And what happens, of course, in 1948 is that on the very, very day that the Israelis declare their own independence, five Arab countries attacked Israel, and that the Israelis managed to survive, so to speak, that they managed to, protect their independence, I think is itself a very, very interesting story, which has some relevance to American foreign policy. Back in that period, the Truman administration placed an embargo on arms to either side. And so to the extent that this new Israeli state was receiving some American arms, they were receiving arms rather illegally. Okay, these are arms that were being smuggled in by some of the same people, I might add, that were also smuggling arms to the IRA, and that would continue into the 1970s. The IRA, in other words, the Irish revolutionaries in Ireland.
And tell us about that class.
You can sign up for it. The class is it's an upper class course. Upper class meaning, in other words, it's not really geared for freshmen or for sophomores in the university. It's geared for those who are juniors and seniors. A number of history majors are going to take it. But I think what makes it a little bit different from a lot of other courses that are taught on similar subjects is that I am bringing American foreign policy squarely into the center of this course. In other words, it's not simply a course about the Middle East. It's also a course about the making of American foreign policy, of American diplomacy over the last 60 years or so.
Interesting. And what kind of feedback do you get from the students, Gary?
Well, I'm not an unbiased observer, but generally speaking, I think the students like the course a lot. I think they learn a lot. It's a course in which I try to go out of my own way to be balanced. I've, for instance, used a textbook over the last few years, which I'm not using this year, but I have used in the past, called Israel, Palestine. Israel/Palestine. It's by a University of Notre Dame professor of political science by the name of Alan Dowdy. And what he does in chapter after chapter, he says, all right, here's the way in which the Israelis look at a situation. Let's say the creation of Israel in 1948. Now let's take a look at the way in which the Arabs look at that situation. Exactly the same 1948. For the Israelis, it represents what? The fulfillment of dreams, of democracy, of independence, of the same kind of recognition nationally that other countries take for granted. From the Arab perspective, it's called the catastrophe. It's called imperialism. It's the establishment from the Arab perspective of a European population into the Middle East, which they view as imperialistic and so forth. And the course continues in that vein with the 1956 war, the 1967, the so-called Six-Day War, and other wars as well.
And our final question for you, Dr. Gary Ostrower. In fact, we could do a whole show on this, and I've talked before with other Alfred professors like Dr. Heinemann and Dr. Westacott on this issue. YouTube. Now, this is a whole different world now that anybody, not just TV stations with professional TV cameras, but anybody can grab their cell phone and start filming, and you don't even know it. In fact, that just happened to State Senator Tom O'Mara Monday night. The story was splashed all over the Albany newspaper, the Albany Times-Union. The next day, a political activist baited him into an argument. O'Mara fell for it, and he lost his cool after a few minutes because the guy started picking on O'Mara's wife. Not really picking on his wife, but he got a little snarky with O'Mara's wife, and O'Mara lost his temper and started yelling at the guy, and he used some expletives there. He didn't hit him, but he raised his voice. Your thoughts on the YouTube phenomenon, Dr. Ostrower?
We live in a very, very different kind of political environment. What we have taken for granted as private conversations no longer can be taken for granted as private. They may wind up on YouTube tomorrow. Sometimes we're recorded. Sometimes we are filmed. I think that all of us have to be in the public area a good deal more careful than we have before. And this has, I might add, some real political implications, not only in respect to the kind of thing you're describing here, locally, but in vis-a-vis Middle Eastern politics or the politics of Europe. The terrorist in Paris who killed the 10 cartoonists and who killed the 4 hostages in the kosher supermarket. This was all, much of it at least, was filmed. We see these guys getting into their car. We see them shooting a cop who is lying unarmed and pleading for his life. We see the terrorists shoot him in the head. Why do we see that? Because we have cell phones, and because those cell phones are going to wind up placing this information, placing these videos onto YouTube within literally minutes of the event itself. Is this going to be inflammatory? The answer is yes. Is this going to be common? Is there any way to put a lid on this? The answer is probably no, unless, as you have in Russia and as you have in some other countries, including Iran, governments which simply prohibit the use of YouTube altogether. And that, of course, presents another kind of a problem.
We've been talking with Dr. Gary Ostrower, the Alfred University professor of history. Dr. Ostrower, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And ABC is next on AM 1480 WLEA Hornell.